My parents abandoned me at 8 with nothing but a suitcase. 24 years later, the stranger who saved me died, leaving me millions. Now they've returned, suing for my inheritance. They think I'm a victim, but I'm a lawyer. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Kin and Karma. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The air in my office felt heavy, the kind of stillness that usually precedes a storm. I was sitting at my mahogany desk, the one Arthur had gifted me when I passed the bar exam. My throat was scratchy, a lingering reminder of the flu that had kept me bedridden for the last 3 days. I shouldn't even have been there, but the grief of losing Arthur a week ago was a far more persistent ache than any fever. I stared at the framed photo on my desk. It wasn't of my biological parents. It was a candid shot of Arthur, his silver hair windswept, a mischievous glint in his eyes as he held up a fish he'd caught during one of our rare weekend trips to the lake. He was the man who had found a shivering 8-year-old girl huddled on a plastic bench at the Greyhound station in the middle of a November downpour. He was the man who hadn't walked away. A sharp rap on the glass door startled me. My assistant, Sarah, walked in, her face pale. She was holding a thick manila envelope, the kind that never contains good news. "Olivia," she whispered, her voice tight with concern. "A courier just dropped this off. It's from a firm downtown, Thorne and Associates." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. I knew that name. Marcus Thorne was a shark, the kind of lawyer who specialized in making the lives of decent people a living hell for a high enough fee. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as I took the envelope. The paper felt unnaturally heavy. I tore it open. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, the bold headings, the names listed as plaintiffs. William, Claire. I stopped breathing. The names sat on the page like a physical weight on my chest. It had been 24 years since I'd heard those names spoken aloud. 24 years since they'd handed me a battered blue suitcase and told me to wait on that bench while they got the tickets. They never came back. "Olivia, what is it?" Sarah asked, moving closer to the desk. I couldn't find my voice for a moment. I looked down at the document again. It was a summons, a formal lawsuit. They were contesting Arthur's will. They were claiming that as my natural and rightful parents, they were entitled to the estate of the man who had actually raised me. They were claiming Arthur had alienated me from them, that he had effectively kidnapped me and brainwashed me into staying with him. They were asking for the entire $3.8 million. The room began to spin. I thought of the funeral, the way I had stood by Arthur's casket, feeling like the last person on earth who truly knew him. And all while I was mourning, while I was trying to figure out how to navigate a world without the only father I'd ever known, they were in some dark office, plotting to take the one thing he'd left to ensure my security. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the complaint. William's handwriting hadn't changed much, still messy, still arrogant. "They're suing me," I finally managed to choke out. "My parents, they've come back for the money." I leaned back in Arthur's chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The irony was a bitter pill. I had spent my entire career as an estate lawyer protecting people from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. I had seen the worst of humanity in probate courts across the state, but I never thought the villains in the story would be my own flesh and blood. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 5. Outside, the city was moving on. People were heading home to their families, oblivious to the fact that my world had just been shattered for a second time by the same 2 people. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't come back for me. They hadn't come back to apologize for the cold bench or the years of silence. They had come back for a payday. The cold ink of the lawsuit felt sharper than the silence they left me with at 8 years old. The following Monday, I found myself sitting in a sterile conference room in Marcus Thorne's office. I had spent the weekend in a blur of research and tears, alternating between drafting my own response and staring at the wall. My flu had worsened into a deep, rattling cough, and my eyes were rimmed with red. I felt fragile, like a piece of glass that had been struck just a bit too hard. The door opened, and Marcus Thorne walked in. He was exactly as I expected: tailored suit, expensive watch, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked two people I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. William was taller than I remembered, his hair thinning, his face etched with the lines of a hard life. He was wearing a suit that was a decade out of style, but he wore it with an unearned confidence. Claire followed, her eyes darting around the room, settling on the expensive art on the walls before finally landing on me. She looked older, tired, but there was a hardness in her gaze that I recognized instantly. It was the same look she'd given me when I'd asked for a second helping of cereal on the morning they left. "Olivia," Claire said, her voice a jarring memory. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out as if to embrace me. "My sweet girl, look at you, a lawyer." I stood up, moving behind my chair to create a barrier. "Don't," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in my hands. "Don't act like this is a reunion." William let out a short, dry laugh. "Now, Olivia, is that any way to talk to your father? We've spent years looking for you. We were devastated when we realized that man had taken you." "That man," I said, the words tasting like copper in my mouth, "was Arthur Pendleton. And he didn't take me, he found me. He found me exactly where you left me." Marcus Thorne cleared his throat, pulling out a chair for his clients. "Let's keep this professional, shall we? We are here to discuss the settlement of the Pendleton estate. My clients feel, and the law supports them, that they were deprived of their daughter's company and support due to the interference of the deceased." He leaned forward, sliding a paper across the table. "We are willing to settle this out of court. A 50-50 split of the liquid assets, and we walk away. No mess, no public scandal." I looked at William and Claire. They were sitting there, nodding as if they were discussing a business transaction. There was no remorse in their eyes, no shame, just a cold, calculating greed. They didn't see a daughter, they saw a $3.8 million lottery ticket. "You left me," I whispered, the weight of the memory threatening to pull me under. It was raining. I was 8 years old. I waited for 10 hours until a security guard called the police. Arthur was the one who stopped the officer from taking me to a state facility that night. He stayed with me. He gave me a home. He gave me an education. He gave me a life. Claire sighed, a dramatic, performative sound. "We were desperate, Olivia. We had no money, no place to go. We thought we were leaving you somewhere safe where someone would find you and give you a better life than we could. And we were right, weren't we? You're a success. But that doesn't change the fact that we are your parents." "You aren't parents," I snapped. "You're biological donors who abandoned their responsibility. Arthur was my parent." William leaned back, a smug grin spreading across his face. "The law doesn't care about feelings, Olivia. It cares about blood. And Marcus here tells us that since there was never a formal adoption, since we never signed away our parental rights, we have a very strong case. You're a lawyer, you know how this works. You can fight us and lose everything to legal fees, or you can be smart." I looked at the three of them, the greedy parents and their predatory lawyer. They thought I was weak. They thought my grief made me an easy target. They saw my cough and my red eyes and assumed I was ready to fold just to make the pain stop. I looked down at the table, my mind racing. I thought of the decades I'd spent with Arthur. I thought of the way he'd taught me to read contracts, the way he'd encouraged me to go to law school, the way he'd always told me to look for the things people didn't say. I looked back up at them, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of something other than pain. It was a cold, sharp clarity. "I won't be settling," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "In fact, I won't even be hiring a firm to defend me." Marcus Thorne chuckled. "You're going to let the estate default. That's a bold strategy." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. I looked William and Claire dead in the eyes. "No, I'll be representing myself." They all laughed. William shook his head, looking at Marcus as if I'd just told a joke. Claire smirked, a cruel, satisfied expression that made my blood boil. They thought I was drowning. They thought I was making a desperate, emotional mistake. But as I walked out of that conference room, the heavy doors thudding shut behind me, I felt a sudden, strange sense of calm. They were so focused on the money, so blinded by their own arrogance, that they hadn't bothered to look into the details of my life or Arthur's past. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. The weeks leading up to the preliminary hearing were the most grueling of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bus station. I saw the headlights of the cars reflecting in the puddles. I felt the scratchy wool of the blanket Arthur had bought for me from the station's gift shop that first night. Arthur hadn't just saved me, he had molded me. He was a retired history professor with a mind like a steel trap and a heart of gold. He didn't have much when we started, or so I thought. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house filled with books and the smell of Earl Grey tea. He worked odd jobs and consulted while I went through school. He spent every penny he had on my tutors, my music lessons, and eventually my law school tuition. I remembered one night during my second year of law school when I was crying over a particularly difficult contracts case. Arthur had sat me down, handed me a mug of tea, and said, "Olivia, remember, the truth is usually hidden in the margins. People focus on the big words, the bold titles, but the power is in the footnotes. Never forget to read the fine print of a person's soul." He had sacrificed everything for me, or so it seemed. I never knew he had millions. He lived so simply. He wanted me to value hard work and integrity above all else. Finding out about the estate after he died was a shock, but it made sense. He wanted to make sure I was never vulnerable again. He wanted to make sure I never had to sit on a cold bench waiting for someone who was never coming back. And now, William and Claire wanted to strip that security away. I spent my nights in the courthouse library, digging through old records, filing motions, and preparing for the fight of my life. I knew I was being watched. Marcus Thorne's associates were constantly checking in on my filings, clearly looking for a weakness. I saw Marcus at the courthouse one morning. He was leaning against a marble pillar, looking like he owned the place. "Olivia," he called out, his voice smooth and condescending. "Still playing lawyer, I see. My clients are getting impatient. The offer is still on the table, though the split is now 60-40 in their favor. Stress is bad for the health, you know. You look tired." I adjusted my briefcase. "I'm fine, Marcus. I'm just preparing my discovery." "Discovery?" He laughed, a short, sharp sound. "What is there to discover? Your parents were poor, they were desperate, and a wealthy man took advantage of their situation to keep their child. It's a classic case of undue influence and parental deprivation. You're fighting an uphill battle with no shoes, Olivia." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Think about your reputation. Do you really want the world to know your parents abandoned you? Do you want your clients to know you were a bus station brat? Settle now, and we keep the details private. Otherwise, I'll make sure every tabloid in the city knows your history." I felt a surge of anger so strong it made my ears ring. He was using my trauma as a weapon. He was trying to shame me into silence. He was exactly the kind of man Arthur had taught me to defeat. I looked at him, and I didn't see a powerful lawyer. I saw a bully. A man who valued assets over people, who saw a grieving woman as a mark. "The details won't stay private, Marcus," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "But it won't be my history that people are talking about. It'll be yours and your clients'." He sneered, turning on his heel and walking away. I watched him go, my heart hammering against my ribs. He was confident because he thought he knew the whole story. He thought he was dealing with a victim who was too broken to fight back. He didn't realize that Arthur hadn't just left me money. He had left me a legacy of resilience. I went back to my office and sat down at my desk. I pulled out a dusty, leather-bound folder that I'd found in the back of Arthur's safe deposit box. It wasn't a legal document, at least, not one that had been filed with the court. It was a personal record Arthur had kept. Inside were photos, letters, and a series of bank statements from 20 years ago. I spent the next 4 hours going through them, my breath hitching as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Arthur had been more than a guardian. He had been a protector in ways I had never imagined. I picked up my phone and called a private investigator I'd worked with on several difficult estate cases. "Hey, Miller, I need you to find someone. a notary who worked in the city back in 2004. Name is Elias Thorne. No relation to Marcus, I hope. As I hung up the phone, I looked at the photo of Arthur on my desk. I could almost hear his voice. Check the margins, Olivia. Read the fine print. I wasn't just representing myself. I was representing the truth. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I knew I was going to win. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by Tuesday morning, the woman who had huddled in Arthur's oversized cardigan crying over tea was gone. In her place stood Olivia, the attorney who had successfully navigated 3 high-profile probate battles in the last year alone. I swapped the cardigan for a sharp, charcoal gray power suit. My cough was mostly gone, replaced by a cold, simmering determination that felt like ice water in my veins. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was a strategist. I met Miller at a small, out-of-the-way diner on the edge of the city. He was a man of few words, a former detective who knew where the skeletons were buried because he'd helped dig a few of them up. He pushed a thin manila folder across the sticky laminate table toward me. "You were right to be suspicious, Olivia," Miller said, his voice a low gravel. "Your parents, William and Claire, they haven't exactly been living the quiet life of regret they described in Thorne's office. I tracked their movements over the last 15 years. They've moved 6 times, always across state lines, and always ahead of a collection agency or a disgruntled business partner." I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the documents, eviction notices, a string of small claims court filings, and a particularly interesting police report from a town in Nevada. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to the report. "That," Miller said, leaning in, "is their previous attempt at a payday. About 10 years ago, they tried a similar stunt with a distant aunt of Claire's who passed away. They claimed they were her primary caregivers and contested her will, which left everything to a local animal shelter. They didn't win that one, but they made enough of a nuisance of themselves that the shelter's board paid them $20,000 just to go away and let the probate close." A wave of nausea rolled over me, but I pushed it down. So they're professional, lost relatives. They wait for a death notice, then swoop in like vultures. "Exactly," Miller nodded. "But here's the kicker. I found Elias, the notary you asked about." My heart skipped a beat, and he's retired, living in a nursing home in the valley. He's sharp as a tack, though. He remembers Arthur Pendleton. He said Arthur was a man who bought insurance for the soul. I told him you were Arthur's daughter, and he agreed to see you. He has his old ledgers, Olivia. He kept copies of everything he notarized for 25 years. I felt a surge of adrenaline. If what I suspected was true, Arthur hadn't just taken me in out of the goodness of his heart, though he certainly had plenty of that. He had anticipated this exact moment. He had known that people like William and Claire don't just disappear. They lurk in the shadows, waiting for the light of a windfall to draw them out. I spent the rest of the day in the nursing home with Elias. He was a frail man with a memory like an encyclopedia. When I showed him the folder from Arthur's safe deposit box, he tapped a specific entry in his 2004 ledger with a trembling finger. "I remember this night," Elias whispered, his eyes clouded with age but bright with the memory. "Mr. Pendleton brought 2 people in, a man and a woman. They looked like they couldn't wait to leave. He had a suitcase with him, not a big one, but it was heavy. He told me it was a private settlement. He made them sign 3 copies of a document. He wanted to make sure that if they ever tried to come back for you, the law would have a very long memory." He pulled a yellowed, carbon copy sheet from his files and handed it to me. As I read the words, I felt a strange mixture of horror and profound gratitude. Arthur had been my shield even when I didn't know I needed one. I drove back to the city with the document locked in my briefcase. The clever trap was no longer just a theory, it was a physical piece of evidence. But I couldn't reveal it yet. In law, timing is as important as the evidence itself. I needed Marcus Thorne to commit to his narrative. I needed William and Claire to stand in a courtroom and lie under oath. I needed them to believe they had already won. The first major confrontation took place in a small, windowless room in the basement of the courthouse for a mandatory settlement conference. Judge Holloway, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for efficiency, sat at the head of the table. Marcus Thorne sat to her left, flanked by William and Claire. They looked smug. Claire was wearing a modest floral dress and dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the grieving mother to perfection. William sat with his arms crossed, staring at me with a look of feigned disappointment. "Miss Brown," Judge Holloway said, looking at me over her spectacles, "you are representing yourself in this matter. Are you certain you wish to proceed without counsel? This is a significant estate, and the claims are serious." "I am certain, Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the room. Marcus Thorne smirked. "Your Honor, we believe this can be resolved quickly. My clients are simply seeking what is rightfully theirs as the biological parents of Olivia. They were in a state of extreme financial distress when they entrusted her to Mr. Pendleton. They never intended for it to be permanent. Mr. Pendleton used his wealth and influence to keep them away, effectively alienating the child from her natural protectors." He turned to me, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Olivia, we understand you are hurt, but wouldn't it be better to honor your parents' struggle? They only want to make up for lost time. With this inheritance, you can finally be a family again." I looked at Claire. "Is that right, Claire? You want to be a family?" Claire sniffled. "Oh, Olivia. Every night for 24 years, I've prayed for this moment. We were so young, so scared. We thought Arthur was helping us, but he took you and threatened us if we ever tried to see you again. He told us he had friends in high places." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. The silence in the room was absolute. "That's a very touching story. It's a shame it's a complete fabrication." William slammed his hand on the table. "Now listen here, girl. You don't talk to your mother that way. We're giving you a chance to do the right thing." "The right thing," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. "Marcus, you mentioned financial distress in 2004. Would you say my parents were so desperate that they might have, I don't know, sold their interest in me?" Marcus laughed, a bark of genuine amusement. "That's an absurd allegation, Olivia. Parental rights cannot be sold in this country. It's a matter of blood and law." "I agree," I said, reaching into my briefcase. "Parental rights cannot be sold, but a legal waiver of all future claims, combined with a notarized confession of intentional abandonment in exchange for a cash settlement, that's a different story entirely." I slid a photocopy of the 2004 document across the table. I watched the color drain from Claire's face. William's eyes darted to the paper, then back to Marcus. Marcus, ever the professional, snatched the paper up and began to read. As his eyes moved down the page, his confident posture began to crumble. The document was a covenant not to sue and release of all parental claims. In it, William and Claire explicitly admitted to leaving me at the bus station with the intent to abandon me. It stated that in exchange for the sum of $50,000, cash, provided by Arthur Pendleton, they waived any and all future claims to my person, my custody, or any estate I might inherit or possess. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized. This is an old piece of paper," Marcus stammered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "This was signed under duress. My clients were destitute. This is unconscionable." "It was signed in the presence of a neutral notary, Elias Thorne," I countered. "Who is alive, well, and prepared to testify that your clients were laughing as they counted the money in the parking lot." William stood up, his face turning a mottled purple. "That man tricked us. He told us it was just a formality. We didn't know what we were signing." "You didn't know $50,000 was a lot of money?" I asked, tilting my head. "Or did you just think Arthur would never tell me? You thought you could take his money to leave, and then take his money again when he died. You thought I was just a paycheck twice over." "This conference is over," Marcus snapped, grabbing his briefcase. "We'll see you at the hearing, Miss Brown. Don't think a single document is going to save you." They scrambled out of the room, William nearly tripping over his own feet. I stayed in my chair, my heart racing. I had won the first round, but Marcus was right about one thing: he wouldn't give up easily. He was a shark, and he just smelled blood, his own. The days following the conference were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus Thorne went on the offensive, filing motion after motion to have the 2004 document suppressed. He claimed it was void as against public policy, and that it had been obtained through fraudulent inducement. Meanwhile, William and Claire weren't sitting idle. They began a smear campaign. I started seeing posts on local social media groups, vague stories about a heartless lawyer who was turning her back on her elderly, impoverished parents. They even managed to get a brief segment on a local, human interest news show, where Claire cried on camera about how much she missed her baby girl. The pressure was immense. My clients at the firm were starting to ask questions. Sarah was fielding dozens of calls a day from reporters, but I didn't waver. I knew that the more they pushed, the more desperate they were. Miller called me on Thursday night. "Olivia, I found something else. Something Marcus Thorne doesn't want you to know." "What is it?" "Thorne isn't just their lawyer, he's a creditor. I dug into his firm's finances. He's been struggling lately, lost a big malpractice suit last year. He didn't take this case on a standard contingency. He loaned William and Claire the money for their living expenses and the filing fees. He's invested over $50,000 of his own money into this lawsuit. If they don't win, he doesn't just lose a fee, he loses his shirt." I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. So Marcus isn't just representing them, he's a partner in the grift. "Exactly," Miller said. "And there's more. I tracked down the other victim from Nevada, the animal shelter. They were so disgusted by William and Claire that they kept a file on them. It turns out your parents used a different name back then. They were the Wilsons. They have a pattern of changing names every time they burn a bridge." This was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just about the 2004 document anymore. It was about a career of fraud. I spent the night drafting my final trial brief. I didn't just focus on the law, I focused on the narrative. I laid out the history of William and Claire, not as parents, but as predators. I detailed their name changes, their previous lawsuits, and Marcus Thorne's personal financial stake in the outcome. The night before the hearing, I went to Arthur's house. I sat in his study, surrounded by his books. I could almost smell the Earl Grey. I felt a profound sense of peace. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the dignity of the man who had seen a lost girl and decided she was worth everything he had. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early. The hallway was crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Marcus Thorne was there, looking frazzled. His usual polish was gone, his tie was slightly crooked, and there were dark circles under his eyes. William and Claire were sitting on a bench, looking triumphant. They still thought they had a chance. They still thought their lies would hold up under the bright lights of a courtroom. As I walked past them, William leaned out and whispered, "Last chance, Olivia. Give us $2 million and we go away. If not, I'll tell the judge everything. I'll tell her how you used to cry for us every night until Arthur told you we were dead. I'll make sure you never work in this town again." I stopped and looked down at him. He looked small, pitiful, a man who had spent his life trying to take things he hadn't earned. "William," I said, my voice calm and clear enough for the nearby reporters to hear, "you can tell the judge whatever you like, but I'd be careful. Perjury carries a much longer sentence than abandonment." I walked into the courtroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind me. The stage was set. The masks were about to come off. And for the first time in 24 years, I wasn't the little girl waiting for someone to come back. I was the one who had finally arrived. The courtroom was a cathedral of cold marble and polished oak, a space designed to dwarf the individual and elevate the law. I sat at the petitioner's table, my back straight, my hands clasped firmly in front of me. To my right, the gallery was packed. Reporters from the local papers sat with their pens poised, and a few familiar faces from the legal community watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They were all there to see the bus station attorney either ascend or crumble. At the respondents' table, Marcus Thorne looked like a man trying to outrun a landslide. He was whispering furiously to William and Claire, who were both dressed in their finest, impoverished, Sunday best. William caught my eye and winked, a gesture so arrogant it made my skin crawl. He still thought this was a game of theater, and he believed he was the better actor. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Holloway entered, her black robes billowing like a dark cloud. She took her seat, her expression unreadable. "We are here for the matter of the estate of Arthur Pendleton. Miss Brown, you have the floor for your opening statement and presentation of evidence." I stood up. The silence in the room was so thick I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. I didn't look at my notes. I looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and resonant. "This case has been presented by the respondents as a story of a family torn apart by a wealthy predator. They have painted a picture of two desperate parents who were forced to part with their child, only to spend decades searching for her. They claim Arthur Pendleton was a kidnapper in a suit." I paused, turning slowly to look at William and Claire. But the law does not deal in paintings, it deals in facts. And the facts of this case are not found in the tears my biological mother has shed for the cameras. They are found in the paper trail of a 24-year grift. Marcus Thorne jumped to his feet. "Objection, inflammatory language." "Overruled," Holloway said sharply. "Continue, Miss Brown." "I would like to call my first witness," I said, "Mr. Elias Thorne." A hush fell over the room as the elderly notary was wheeled to the stand. With Miller's help, he had brought his original ledgers. Under my questioning, Elias recounted the night in 2004 with devastating clarity. He described how William and Claire had laughed while signing the document that traded their daughter for $50,000. "They didn't look like people losing a child," Elias whispered into the microphone, his voice echoing through the chamber. "They looked like people who had just won the lottery. The man, William, even asked if he could get the payment in hundreds because it looked better in a stack." I saw the reporters scribbling furiously. Claire buried her face in her hands, but I noticed she wasn't actually crying. She was checking to see if the cameras were catching her distress. "Next," I said, "I would like to introduce Exhibit D. These are certified records from the state of Nevada." I walked over to Marcus's table and handed him the documents. I watched his eyes widen as he realized what I had found. "These records," I told the court, "detail a 2012 lawsuit filed by a William and Claire Wilson. The details are strikingly similar: a contested will, a claim of parental or familial deprivation, and a demand for a multi-million-dollar settlement. In that case, they were suing an animal shelter. Today, they are suing their own daughter." "This is irrelevant," Marcus shouted, his face turning a deep shade of red. "Past litigation has no bearing on the current standing of biological parental rights." "It has everything to do with intent, Your Honor," I countered. "It establishes a pattern of racketeering and fraud. It proves that William and Claire are not here because they love me. They are here because they are professional litigants who change their names as often as they change their stories." I turned my attention to the most important part of my strategy. I called Claire to the stand. She walked up with a performative limp, her eyes downcast. Marcus tried to lead her through a series of soft questions, but I saw the judge's patience wearing thin. When it was my turn to cross-examine, I didn't go for the jugular immediately. I started softly. "Claire," I said, standing near the witness box, "you've said you spent every day for 24 years looking for me. Is that correct?" "Every single day," she sobbed. "My heart was a hollow shell." "Then why," I asked, pulling a document from my pile, "did you file for a change of social security number and a new state ID under the name Claire Wilson only 3 months after you left me at the station? If you were looking for me, wouldn't you want to keep your name the same so the police, or I could find you?" She stammered, her eyes darting to William. We were hiding from creditors. We had to start over." "And did starting over involve taking $50,000 from Arthur Pendleton?" "He forced us," she cried. "He said he'd call the police on us for child abandonment if we didn't take the money and sign that paper." "So you took the money to avoid the consequences of abandoning your child?" I asked. "You chose a payout over your daughter's safety." "It wasn't like that." And what about Marcus Thorne? I asked, shifting gears. How are you paying for his services, Claire? We know you claim to be destitute. He's helping us out of the goodness of his heart, she lied. Your Honor, I said, turning to the bench. I have a subpoenaed bank record from Thorne and Associates. It shows a series of personal loans made by Mr. Thorne to the respondents totaling $58,000. This isn't a legal representation, it's a joint venture. Mr. Thorne is a primary stakeholder in this fraud. He didn't take this case to seek justice. He took it to recoup his own failing firm's losses. The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway banged her gavel with a force that sounded like a gunshot. Order! I will have order in this court. Marcus Thorne looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. William was on his feet now, shouting something unintelligible at me. But the most powerful moment came from someone I hadn't expected to speak. Sitting in the back row was a young man, barely 20, who had been traveling with William and Claire. I had assumed he was just a hired driver or a distant relative. He stood up, his face pale and his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp clarity. They lied to me too. He shouted, his voice cracking. This was Leo, my half-brother I had only recently discovered through Miller's research. He had been told I was a greedy sister who had stolen their family's rightful inheritance. They told me you were the villain, Olivia. They said if we won this, we'd finally have a home. He looked at William and Claire with a look of pure disgust. You used me as a prop, just like you used her. Leo turned and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy doors thudding behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. The family William and Claire had tried to project had shattered in front of the entire world. I looked at my biological parents. They weren't smirking anymore. They looked small, withered, and exposed. The truth hadn't just defeated them, it had stripped them bare. The judge's ruling was swifter and more scathing than I could have hoped for. She didn't just dismiss the case. She ordered Marcus Thorne to be investigated by the State Bar Association for unethical conduct and personal financial entanglement with his clients. Furthermore, she referred the matter of William and Claire to the district attorney's office for investigation into fraud and perjury. In 20 years on the bench, Judge Holloway had said, looking directly at William and Claire, I have rarely seen a more cynical or calculated attempt to weaponize the legal system against the very person you were meant to protect. This court finds the 2004 agreement to be a valid reflection of your intent. You didn't lose a daughter, you sold a burden. You have no claim to this estate, and frankly, you have no claim to the title of parents. As the courtroom cleared, I stayed at my table for a long time. The weight that had been on my shoulders for 24 years, the weight of wondering if I was the reason they left, the weight of the bus station girl, finally lifted. A week later, I stood in Arthur's study. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The $3.8 million was secure, but the money felt secondary to the peace I felt. I had used a portion of the funds to set up a trust for Leo. He was a victim in this too, and I wanted to make sure he had the education and support William and Claire would never provide. We had spoken briefly on the phone. It would take time to build a relationship, but for the first time, I had a brother. The downfall of William and Claire was swift. Without the inheritance to pay back Marcus Thorne, and with the fraud investigation looming, they fled the state again. But this time, Miller was tracking them. They were arrested in Arizona on outstanding warrants related to their Wilson aliases. They would spend the next several years in a state facility, not a bus station, but a prison cell. I picked up the photo of Arthur. We did it, I whispered. I had realized something important during the trial. Arthur hadn't left me the money just to keep me safe. He had left it to give me the resources to fight back. He knew that the world could be a cold place for a girl on a bench, and he wanted to make sure I had the fire to keep myself warm. I walked out of the house and drove to the cemetery. I placed a single bouquet of yellow roses, his favorite, on his headstone. The air was crisp and smelled of rain, but I didn't feel cold. I felt vindicated. I felt loved. I wasn't the girl from the Greyhound station anymore. I was Olivia Brown, a woman who knew her worth, a woman who had represented herself and won, and a daughter who had finally brought her father's legacy home.